joining the inaugural human. Oops, sorry, I'm just trying to admit someone at the same time as I'm speaking. Welcome and thank you for joining our inaugural webinar. We're really looking forward to hosting you today. So I'd like to commence the webinar by acknowledging the traditional lands on which we meet today across the country, and also for those attending overseas on your lands, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So before we start, I'd just like to do a little bit of housekeeping. So could everybody please just make sure that you have your mobile phones or your devices on mute. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions at any stage. So feel free to pop those questions into the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout the discussion, and we'll leave those till the end, and then we'll be able to get to any of your questions. If you have a question that's actually specific for one of the presenters, please just pop their name in so that we know who you're actually also looking for in regards to responding to that question, just so that it's a little clear for us. And also just wanted to highlight that some of this discussion does actually discuss suicide and sexual harassment, which may be distressing for some participants. So again, if you need support, the Lifeline number is in the chat if anybody needs that. Okay, so with that, let's talk about the other side of safety on World Safety Day. So what I'd like to do is just really briefly introduce the three amazing panel members that we have on here with me today. So I'm going to start with Will Snow. So Will is the founder of Snow Legal. He brings deep expertise in employment law and a strong focus on ethical, human-centered decision-making into the workplace. He is passionate about how culture shapes behaviour and how employers can lead with clarity, consistency and care. Will's thoughtful approach aligns perfectly with Human's mission to create workplaces where people can truly thrive. Welcome and thank you, Will, for your time. Martin Campbell. So Martin doesn't just talk safety, he's lived it, led it and enforced it. With a background in law and decades of experience as a regulator and a regulatory leader, he's prosecuted individuals and organisations that have failed to put people first. Excuse me. He knows exactly what happens when psychosocial risks are ignored and has made it his mission to change that. As the former executive director of Safe Work SA, Martin has seen the best and worst of workplace culture. And that is why he's one of the co-founders of Human, coming to present to you today. And last but definitely not least is Sam Young, who is a registered clin psych and experienced cultural strategist. Sam spent decades helping leaders navigate the complexities of people performance and change with clarity, empathy, and a touch of class and sass. She's a sought-after guest speaker and thought leader in leadership, wellbeing, and psychologically safe workplaces. She's known for making the complex feel refreshingly human. And she was actually, up until recently, the founder and CEO of Human Psychology, which was Adelaide's largest provider of psychological services, which she recently sold to APM Group in 2023. And again, is now also one of the co-founders of Human. So thank you for all of our amazing panelists and welcome. So with that, just to let you know, we will be recording this session just for training purposes so that we can learn from what we're doing with you all today. So I'm going to start with a question to Will. So Will, can we start with maybe unpacking workplace expectations of psychosocial safety, given that there is a change in regards to the cohorts that we're now seeing in the workplace, and the younger people are definitely tolerating a lot less bad behaviour, and we see that they'll raise concerns. Are you able to kind of talk to us a little bit about that and what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely, Kristen. So I think for all of us on the in this webinar now and going forward, we've all got to be conscious that the cohort of the employees that we look after, that we manage, that we support has shifted. And what I've seen a lot in my practice have been issues which are being raised by sort of more frequently are issues being raised, number one, and that they're being raised by people who may be younger or maybe in the past mightn't have felt comfortable in raising issues of concern. So a good example of that was a matter from the Fair Work Commission, which Snow Legal was involved in defending for the employer in January this year, where complaints were raised and to the great courage of those individuals by apprentices, by young people regarding the bad behaviour of a supervisor. This was an individual who had significant sort of power within the organisation. He had the power to dictate if you got dirty jobs or clean jobs, and the sorts of work that people wanted to do and the less attractive tasks. And in that matter, there was a great courage that was taken by younger employees, younger people, to raise issues of concern. And again, not so much in the context of them being aware, perhaps, of new regulations around managing psychosocial hazards, but more given that the organisation had a visible grievance management policy, it had provided training on those issues, and people felt supported when they did raise those concerns. So the challenge then, I think, for HR, and in particular when we're thinking about psychosocial hazards, is how are your policies and how is your organisation set up to sort of triage, to manage, to hear, and to resolve issues of concern, knowing that there will be increased volume of those things as people are more broadly, firstly, aware of their rights, so to speak, but also have a great less tolerance for putting up with maybe rubbish that previous generations might have put up with.
Great, thank you. Definitely seeing that myself in my world as well. So the second question that I have is around the psychosocial hazards and obviously the regulator interactions that we're sort of seeing out there arising from worker suicide. And Will, you've obviously been involved in some where staff and managers have been questioned about their knowledge of the stresses that have taken place after suicide. Are you able to talk us through, what you've seen and what are some of the hazards that have arisen from this?
Yeah, absolutely, Kristen. So firstly, just looking at this slide, that sort of gives us a very quick summary of where we're up to broadly in Australian states and territories. And that is that under states and territory legislation, psychosocial hazards are now being much more prescriptively, that is in detail, set out as to the risk management measures that employers, that businesses and organisations must follow to manage those risks, as you would manage working at heights or in confined spaces. So those are more detailed obligations, not newer, but more detailed obligations, are now cascading through in lots of different ways. So we'll probably come to some other cases directly, but what that means from an organisation perspective is that if a worker self-harm or suicide arises, and there are work issues that are alleged to have been a factor into it, then you need to understand that most likely the police, through the instructions of the coroner, and maybe eventually or at the same time, the safety regulator, may well wish to question your supervisors, your managers, about the knowledge of those certain issues. So two sort of case studies, for want of a better term. One was when a manager knew that the colleague who reported to him was particularly vulnerable. So he'd had a significant pattern of absences, had in fact disclosed that he had chronic depression. This manager actually gave great support to this individual, checked in with him, provided him with resources and time off, and also really sought to understand his symptoms better. That worker really sadly took his own life, and it was alleged by the housemates, in fact, of the worker that no, he did this because he was being bullied at work. And in that situation, what the employer had to do with the manager and with some legal support as well was to explain to the police, who at that stage were investigating, what was known at the time and what was done in response and what other support measures were provided. In another example where someone took their own life, the widow of the deceased raised an allegation that no, the employee took his own life because he was in fact being bullied by a colleague at work, and there the manager again needed to go through a process there with the safety regulator of explaining their knowledge of workplace stressors. So, and this actually arose during COVID, and the issue was, well, the employee raised a concern that he was being overworked. What do you say about that? And the response to that was, well, look, this was work in a healthcare setting. Look, we were all being overworked at that stage. We're doing as best as we could. The allegation was raised that this employee was isolated. It was working in a very remote setting. What did you do? And there the manager said, no, well, look, I acknowledge that, but we tried to organise catch-ups via Zoom and on Teams, and we sought to have some like social events so that we could, debrief a bit in this extraordinary period. So effectively, the manager was then, really forced through this questioning process from the regulator to, go through her phone, her WhatsApp messages to say, look, this is what I knew of the issues at the time. This is what the broader organisation knew of the issues at the time. And these are the things that we did to try and manage those risks. So again, that was another matter where the employer and the manager could demonstrate they took all reasonable steps, that they ensured safety so far as reasonably practicable. This is the language about safety and risk management, to ensure that the work was as safe as possible for that individual. So yeah, these are sort of anecdotal experiences. There are cases, of course, that have sort of looked at these issues, and it might actually get you, Kristen, to jump to that next slide, please. So there's a number of cases that have emerged which have brought up psychosocial safety hazards and risks in lots of different contexts. There's, BHP with a class action about sexual harassment and discrimination. There's a very recent case from the High Court, which was about an employee claiming compensation for psychiatric injury arising from a failure to follow the employer's disciplinary policy. Very, very recently, as of last month, a prosecution was in fact withdrawn against the Western Sydney Local Health District, which was, the allegation there was essentially that the Western Sydney Local Health District hadn't provided sort of procedural fairness and had mismanaged an investigation into the misconduct allegations involving a nurse. So lots of different case examples there, which are all about really one of my key focuses with work is sort of supporting HR, but also how organisations have responded to issues of concern as and when they've been raised.
Great, thank you. I don't know, Martin, whether you wanted to add anything, obviously coming from a regulator point of view in regards to what Will has just highlighted, because I know there was a recent one with an accountant that was in the courts as well just recently.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Chris. And look, when I was a regulator, we investigated a few complaints of bullying, but also of people who'd taken their own lives because of workplace bullying. So it's an incredibly complicated investigation to undertake. South Australia, certainly South Australia, but other regulators as well, are training inspectors in the same investigation techniques as police. What that allows you to do as a regulator is work collaboratively with the police throughout the whole coronial process. So as Will rightly said, the police will have primacy, but it's not uncommon for safety regulators to work with the police in their incident rooms. So an example of that was the Anna Marie Smith workplace death. And you remember that Anna was a disabled lady who died through neglect because of her carer, and her carer was imprisoned for that. Now, there were two safe work investigators worked in the SAPOL incident room with the investigation team at that time. SAPOL and Safe Work were undertaking the same investigation, but through different lenses. So the police were looking through the criminal legislation, Safe Work through the Work Health and Safety Act. But it's also really helpful that when there's evidence which can link the bullying to the workplace. So there's a whole raft of legal sort of law of evidence, rules, and causation here. The risk to work health and safety has to be foreseeable. So if that risk is foreseeable, i.e., you know that somebody's mentally unwell, then you should be taking that into account. So there was a few cases around organizations who had psychological safety as part of their management system, which allowed them to then defend against complaints. Because people make all sorts of allegations, and when an allegation is made, it doesn't mean that somebody's done something wrong. It just means an investigation will start. And if there is a breach, then there's a whole decision-making process as to whether that breach deserves a criminal charge or there is some other compliance outcome that you can take. So if you look at sort of the case of Dunlop Rubber Australia and Buckley, which was from 1952, but the point from this case is that a duty holder must not only have regard for the ideal worker, they must also take into consideration one who is careless, inattentive, or inadvertent. So when you're developing your safety management systems in relation to psych safety, there are some considerations that you need to put in place when you do that. So don't write your procedures for the gold standard, world class, super duper superstar employee, because that's probably not going to fly in the long run. You've got to take into account, and you've also got to look at that foreseeability of risk as to those workers who are a little bit negligent in carrying out their task. So it's not a really clear cut system, and if people come to you to sort of do work or sell systems and it looks too simple, then it probably is, and it just requires you to do a little bit more digging to make sure that you get something that suits your organization and the work that you do.
Great,
I'll
thank
stop
you.
there.
Okay, so moving on to question number 3. So this is around aspects of bad behaviour, again, being obviously further regulated and focused on unwelcome sexual conduct in the workplace, and then new definitions of these new categories, and obviously the unlawful sex discrimination and positive duty. Are you able to talk to us a little bit more about that, please, Will?
Yes, absolutely. So it's worthwhile that we all consider unwelcome sexual conduct as a psychosocial hazard. Firstly, I mean that sort of should be self-evident. That is, it's a hazard which arises from work. Thank you very much. And there's a slide here as well that particular sort of sets out all the various ways in which work can create hazards for our mental health and our well-being. So sexual harassment in particular is worthwhile separately considering for 3 reasons. So firstly, we have a new definition of sexual harassment, which is a few years old now, but still it's amazing how often I still see it being misidentified and incorrectly defined actually in policy. So our definition now is it's unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that causes offence, so I need to be offended, and it must be reasonable to anticipate the possibility that the behaviour would cause offence. So on this first part of the 3 things I want to talk about, it means that the threshold for meeting that definition, and that's a significant threshold issue because then we're talking about serious misconduct, we're talking about the legal claims that can arise from sexual harassment, is very low. So with that first one, I've had investigations and issues which have arisen due to, for example, a manager befriending a junior employee on Instagram and then in the middle of the night liking all the photos from way back when of her in her bathers at the beach with flame emojis. She gets very upset in the morning, justifiably so. She raises a complaint. And then the question is it reasonable to anticipate the possibility that a more junior female employee would find that behaviour, liking at 3 in the morning, very, very old photos of her on the beach on Instagram, as unwelcome? Then the answer is, well, I guess it is reasonable to anticipate that possibility. The second issue with unwelcome sexual conduct or with sexual harassment really is new laws regarding work environments that are hostile on the ground of sex. So this issue, again, this arose in a recent matter where a manager was found to only refer to women in the workplace, and again, sort of language warning here, as bitches. He called them the bitches upstairs, the service bitches, those bitches. So derogatory wording which is targeted at a particular gender and creates a hostile work environment, and would be reasonable to anticipate the possibility that the work environment will be hostile, is a separate ground of unlawful sex discrimination, which is new as of 2 years ago. And then lastly, on the three things why sexual harassment is a separate own category of conduct to really think about as a risk to manage and to mitigate, is that all Australian employers, local government, state government, Commonwealth, big or small, not-for-profit, for-profit, whatever, must take positive steps to, have a positive duty to take steps to prevent unlawful sex discrimination from occurring. So a set and forget approach to this particular psychosocial hazard is unacceptable, and you need to be thinking about what do our policies say? Are they accessible? How are we training people about policies? What does our reporting say about the complaints that people are raising? How are we addressing issues when they're being concerned, when they're being raised? And how are we looking after people who have been impacted by this behaviour? So that's why, Kristen, in particular, that as one of the particular hazards there up on the slide does sit out as an issue. And indeed why, for example, BHP had in their annual report last year, a page and a half devoted to these are the complaints that we have received regarding sexual harassment. This is the money that we have spent on managing sexual harassment as a safety issue. We have installed new lighting at our remote work sites to the tune of, millions of dollars. That we have a better complaint handling framework. So organisations are getting a lot tighter and actually a lot better about managing this as a standalone risk.
Great, thank you. Okay, Martin, over to you. So given what Will has just discussed with us, what do employers and officers need to do about all of this?
Yeah, so the first thing is not the first thing they need to do is not stress out about it, okay? Because probably the last 18 months, I've seen a lot of organizations who have stressed out, and that stress has then paralyzed them and they haven't done anything. So first thing I say to people is sort of cool your jets a little bit, and then let's think about getting psychosocial risk on the agenda. So people generally refer to this as sort of bullying and sexual harassment, and they're the two sort of labels that people attribute to it. My experience the last 18 months to 2 years is that they don't really fully appreciate the depth and breadth of what psychosocial safety is. And what Will's just articulated is are really good examples of how broad it can be. So what I've been doing the last 18 months is working with executives and leadership teams and boards to get this on the safety radar. Because people don't necessarily fully understand the breadth and depth of it, they just don't do anything, or they'll just target a couple of these hazards. So I've been saying, I remember when we first wrote the legislation and drafted the code of practice at probably 2009, 19 now, I reckon, 2019, 20, at the Safe Work Board. We sort of deliberately deliberately made this broad to cover as many of the scenarios that can mentally hurt people as possible. The challenge is, what do you do about it? Because these are not just a safety problem. So Glenn Farrell, who's now the regulator in South Australia, said a couple of conferences last year that if you leave this just in your safety team, you're destined to failure. And he's 100% correct. And I agree with that. This is a HR, IR, and a safety problem, and you need a collaborative approach. So when you look at these hazards, originally 14 in the code of practice, and then the Commonwealth added another 3 around intrusive surveillance and job insecurity and fatigue. But these are really grouped in behaviors, processes, and systems, and then organizational factors. So these really cross over between what was the old view of HR and safety. And it needs HR and safety and IR to come to the table to resolve them. So the first step for me is get it on the risk register, get it on the risk agenda, and leadership start to prioritize it. The safety and the HR and the IR functions come together to do the risk assessment. So do your risk landscape and establish where your benchmark, your baseline is. Don't stress if it's not too good because that's your baseline. The challenge then is to make improvements, put controls in place that make tangible improvements. So then you say, well, but what controls do we put in place? Because you can't, like conventionally safety, we put a guard on a machine, we barricade something, we buy new machinery. It's some form of engineering, physical control that you can see. This stuff is different. You can't see it. So how do you change behavior in order to keep people mentally safe at work? And as Will said, it's about leadership. It's about providing supervisors and managers and executives with the tools and skills to have critical conversations. Psychosocial safety is not about letting people do what they want whenever they want. It's not about chaos. In actual fact, it's the opposite. There's actually a lot of structure around it, but it's about having some rules that are executed with professionalism, with dignity and respect. So you've still got to have difficult conversations. You've still got to performance management people. You've still got to address underperformance, but you do it in a manner that doesn't psychologically damage people. And having it as part of your safety system will allow you to do it with respect, professionalism, and dignity. But also, if somebody does make a complaint, then it'll allow you to genuinely defend that position. So expect complaints. Gen Z is the largest demographic in our workforce now. Um, there's research and comments from that demographic that say psychological safety is an expectation of their work. They view this as part of their employment contract. So it's not a nice to have. Like they're looking for it. And if it's not there, they'll go somewhere else. The other thing, as Will said, is that generation particularly aren't shy of complaining. So they'll address these issues. And look, and when it comes down to delivering bad news, nobody likes getting bad news. So if people do complain that they're being bullied, it might just be they're being performance managed or they're on the receiving end of a difficult conversation. So having this on the risk agenda and part of your safety system allows you to address those complaints when they do come through, and being able to articulate to the regulator that you know what your risks are, that you've got controls in place, and most importantly, you're monitoring those controls to make sure that they work as intended. And that's the bit a lot of people are forgetting at the moment.
Thank you, Martin. So just another follow-up question for you. So when we think about actual employers, boards, executives, that type of senior layer of an organization, what should they be doing right now?
So I talk to boards and executive groups around what their duties are. So outlining that primary duty of care under the Work Health and Safety Act, which is an organizational duty. The business has a duty to provide a safe system of work, and that includes a psychologically safe system as well as physically safe system. And then unpacking the duty as an officer. So as a senior leader in an organization, they have a duty to ensure that the business is doing the right thing as well. So that officer duty is about exercising due diligence. The legislation outlines what those due diligence requirements are. When you look at the first bullet point of that, it talks around a senior leader, an officer must know the hazards and risks relating to their business. Um, the recent case in the Port of Auckland in New Zealand, the CEO was charged with breaching his officer duties, fined $130,000. That related to a worker who died, and it's because there was controls put in place around the lifting of containers on and off ships. But the common practice on the wharf was that procedure was ignored. So when the container was lifted, there should be nobody around. Workers regularly walked underneath it. The risk was known. The procedure was bypassed. So the workers imagined versus workers done concept was just not there. Now the CEO was held accountable for that because that risk was foreseeable, and he didn't ensure that the organization was managing it properly. So what I say to organizations is you need to get it on the risk register, because there's a duty as the organization, but there's also a duty on the individual. And a lot of states and territories now have legislated against insurance against that. So your company director insurance, your preferred personal professional indemnity won't cover you, and you can't delegate that duty, so it's yours. And work health and safety breaches are crimes, so you'll end up potentially with a criminal offence if a court mandates that's the way it goes. So you could end up with a criminal offence for breaching work health and safety duty. The fine is personal. We then look at how much that costs, and I talk to boards around what would it cost you personally before it really impacted your life. Um, Most of us don't have 30, 50, 75,000 under the bed. So you're really selling assets or remortgaging in order to pay that penalty. So you try and sort of trigger people's attention in different ways. Um, some senior executives just get this because they are people, and they generally want to do the right thing by their workers. Others need to be triggered by the return on investment, the productivity, or what it's going to cost them personally. So I generally approach it from all of those in order to get traction, and then the next step is, right, you get your safety and your HR leadership together, and you get this risk process started. And there are some easy and pretty cheap ways to do that.
Great, thank you. Which is a great segue into Sam. So Sam, when we talk about the people, could you talk about some of the other costs that are actually associated with poor psychosocial safety at work?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kristen. So as a clean psych, I think, Will and Martin have spoken to the potential legal and financial costs. And as a psych, I think the human cost of poor psychosocial safety is the big one. So when I was at human psychology, we probably, 8,000 consults a year across all industries, public and private sector. And honestly, I think we're in an emotional recession, not just an economic one currently. And there's some really concerning trends that I'm seeing coming through. So one is spending cuts for wellbeing initiatives. So as budgets are tightening, we're seeing them fall off, or reactive, tactical, tokenistic wellbeing initiatives. And I guess in parallel to that is what I'll call the individualization of wellbeing. So it's almost like a weaponization of resilience and wellbeing, pushing that down to be an individual imperative rather than an organizational one. And the analogy that works for me there is the canary in the coal mine. So we don't blame the canary for getting sick. We look at what's wrong with the coal mine. And I think, we were routinely asked to go in and deliver 1 hour stress management workshops to workforces that were just buckling under unrealistic expectations and workload and exposure, to occupational violence. So there's some really concerning trends. And then coupled with that, we've got these really passionate, capable, well-meaning HRWHS teams who have described to me screaming into the void to leadership, trying to get traction on this, trying to get it onto the agenda, and just not getting it hitting at that senior executive level. And, we know nearly 1 in 6 Australian employees experience a significant level of mental ill health in a 4-week period at any one time. And our disease burden in Australia from mental health issues is actually amongst the highest in the world. So about 3/4 of GPs rate mental health in the top 3 presenting issues that they see. And whilst like 90% of Australians think mental health is a really important issue for business, only 50% believe their workplace is actually, mentally healthy. And, the recent stats on burnout and wellbeing, about 40% of us in Australia report feeling highly stressed weekly, and about 1/3 are saying, I think I'm burnt out. So burnout's not a clinical disorder, but it is recognised by the WHO, the World Health Organization, as a clinical syndrome. And we've been named as one of the most dangerous places to work in the world. with the highest recorded rates of psychological, physical, and sexual violence. And so I guess pulling all that together, mental health isn't just like an individual or personal issue, it's everyone's business. And I've got this really strong view, I guess, that humans aren't hazards, right? And so, yeah, emotional recession, the metrics are trending down. We've got some fantastic, capable HR, WHS people out there desperately trying to move the dial, and it's just getting stopped at that leadership level.
Great, thank you. And so when we talk about the good psychosocial safety impact on workplaces, can you talk to us around what that looks like if people do or organisations do it well?
Absolutely. So this is I talked about the stick. This is the carrot, right?
Yeah.
So PricewaterhouseCoopers were commissioned by Beyond Blue to do a study into the return on investment in genuine wellbeing initiatives, right? So I'm not talking just chucking pedometers at people or whatever, but proper wellbeing initiatives. And they found a minimum $2.30 return straight to the bottom line for every dollar invested. More recent numbers I've seen is probably closer to $4, taking into account increased productivity, reduced absenteeism, reduced turnover, reduced work cover claims, reduced severity of work cover claims, increased net promoter score. You know, all of those things combine to create a really powerful ROI. Google's Project Aristotle, they identified psychological safety as the key indicator for high-performing teams. And we know good mental health at work is directly linked to engagement, productivity, performance. So if we're going to focus on the hard KPIs of the P&L, it actually drives sustainable profit. Whereas burnout kills performance, toxic leadership kills performance. And I kind of see creating a mentally healthy workplace as the noble gateway to both, right? That they're not mutually exclusive. We can have sustainable, high-performing, profitable entities.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess we have to consider what leadership can do differently, right? Because I think there's a couple of things, and we talked about this last week at one of our events around the fact that there's a lot of leaders that are promoted into leadership positions and potentially don't always have the tools given to them when they're promoted. So what can leadership do differently for those people that are on the webinar today going, right, well, I'm a leader, what do I need to do? What are some of your thoughts on that, Sam?
I love this statistic again from Beyond Blue. Despite 1 in 5 Australians experiencing mental health problems each year, nearly half of all senior managers believe none of their workers will experience a mental health problem at work. Right? So that disconnect or that denial, I think, is the first point. Yeah. I think, you know, burnout's often blamed on workload or remote work or other factors like that. There's a kind of quieter culprit at play, and that's leadership behaviour. So I'm seeing this, I'm going to call it always on, always anxious culture really building across workplaces. So this hustle culture, you know, the grind, emails at midnight, praising overwork, wearing burnout like this competitive badge of honour. It's like, oh, how are you? I'm so busy. And then the person you're talking to will be like, yeah, but I'm busier. You know, these back-to-back meetings. So whilst we might be saying your well-being's important, take care of yourself, our actions scream, never switch off. So, you know, Microsoft found after hours work increased by 30% globally in 2023, and the top driver was leadership modelling. So, you know, our people are watching us, and good intentions do not cancel out harmful environments. So generally, I think people are really well-intentioned and leaders are really well-intentioned, but empathy without action actually ends up feeling like gaslighting at the end of the day. So we know wellbeing's not solved by one-off days and by no more cupcakes, guys. Running mandatory resilience training, if teams are drowning in unrealistic expectations, in unsafe work environments, those gestures can feel really tone deaf or even offensive. So a Deloitte study found that about half of employees who left their jobs due to poor mental health said that whilst their leaders seemed supportive, they didn't actually do anything to reduce the actual causes of stress. So empathy means changing the system. I think KPIs need to include for leadership things like wellbeing. Yeah, so we do what's measured, and toxic workplace behaviour is 10 times more predictive of burnout than workload alone. So I want us to kind of redefine what we're rewarding and include wellbeing as a KPI metric, because otherwise kind of results are trumping humanity at the end of the day. So I think let's try and celebrate rest, not just resilience. And leadership is a tough gig. I'm not saying that people aren't trying their absolute hardest, but it doesn't just shape results, right? It shapes people's lives. And what we do genuinely impacts people's whole lives. So the well-being of your people is not a soft metric. It's actually our legacy as leaders. So we don't need perfect, we need present, we need authentic. And I guess we need genuine commitment to well-being, not just performative. I call it safety theatre.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Okay, well, this is where we get to move into the Q&A. We've got 15 minutes to go. So I'm assuming that I can't see the chat because I've got a number of screens sharing, but I know, Sam, you've been tracking the chat for me. Do you have any questions in the chat, or would anybody like to pop off mute and ask a question? Is anyone going to be courageous and be the first person?
Why people are thinking about that, I might just sort of following from what Sam says. So there was a case a few years ago, Peter Carroll and Caringal Incorporated. The case was around micromanagement and bullying, but the point of that case was that the manager was a micromanager and verbally aggressive and bullying. Now, his excuse and his defense in court was that he genuinely had the best interests of the business and he thought he was doing the right thing. So he didn't think there was anything wrong with what he was doing. Court said irrelevant. So even if you have an employee, a manager, or senior leader who thinks that what they're doing is great and they're doing it with all the best intentions, it's still not going to be defendable for you. So, and on those behaviours, there was another more recent one, which was Frost and Victoria Ambulance Service, which was in 2024 in the Fair Work Commission. So Frost was a particularly prickly individual who was just generally rude and disrespectful, particularly to women. Didn't say hello to them, grunted at them, would make men coffees but not women coffees, etc. Now, the point in that case, or one of the points in that case, was that the commissioner said, and I've got a bit of a quote here, that Frost had failed to treat the complainant with courtesy, civility, respect, and dignity, belittled her contributions, and failed to create a safe, encouraging, supportive, and respectful environment free from discrimination, harassment, and bullying. I find this is bullying behavior and it creates a health and safety risk. So that wasn't a leader, that was a worker who was doing that. And it wasn't probably the sort of conventional bullying that we all have in our mind where you've got people pointing and berating at people. This was somebody who was just rude. And we've probably all come across those people in our past where it's like, oh, that's just Fred. He's always like that. Just ignore him. Well, you can't ignore that Fred anymore. You've got to address the behavior, which goes back to the whole point of having really clear, easy to follow, articulate procedures that people then apply in the workplace with professionalism, respect, and dignity, and you hold those individuals to account.
Thank you. I think we have a show of hand. We've got a courageous person coming off speaker. Zin.
If I can find my unmute button, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I got to this because of Martin, right? So to this, I think I quite agree with what Martin, Sam, and Will said in that regard. What we are doing, I'm the manager of health and safety systems at Arkham Water, Canberra's water utility service provider. What we are doing at the moment is basically having whole organizational risk assessments by each department on their psychosocial risk hazard certain risks, and then holding these workshops or survey-based hazard identification tool. Right, in that the first loft of the one that we done is the health and safety team, because we also have psychosocial risk, associated with us. So in that angle, what I found through practice is people are more likely to talk about the behavior side rather than in line with what Sam was talking about. That's damage that has been done. People are more likely to talk about the behavior side rather than how work has induced those hazards upon them, like the stress, not only the stress, the workload, work demand and things like that. I think one of the key things is changing our design, of the work and actually go straight into the core of it, right? From that angle, in it. But I really appreciate this session. It's really useful. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Kristen, we have a question here, which I think is beautifully put. What are the cheap, easy ways to get the risk process started? I'm going to chuck that at you, Martin.
Look, the cheapest, easiest way is old-fashioned Excel spreadsheet. There's nothing easier and cheaper and quicker than that. Get a group together, a representative group from across your organization, and start talking around the hazards. As Shin said, the behaviors is generally what comes up, but don't forget it's about work design, about system design, the design of work. It's about how you think work is done versus how work is actually done. So once you get all of those things on the table, great. We Human, we use an electronic platform which is Scodel. Scodel is a fantastic tool to allow workers anonymously or by name to record how they feel against each of those 17 psychosocial hazards. What that does is it pumps out a radar graph of your risk landscape and allows you to see where the higher risks are, and then you can address them. So the benefit of that and the reason that we adopt Scodel and partner with them is because you can run that report monthly or quarterly, and it allows you to adjust your controls and your strategies really regularly and gives you a really good indication. So over a period of 12 to 24 months, you can see those risk radars coming in and out. And hopefully what you're going to see is that they all shrink into the middle, which means you're addressing it and the risks are low. So there's a couple of ways you can do it. It doesn't, do you know what? It really shouldn't be expensive. It should just be a bit of time and effort. And when you start the journey, what I've found every time I've done this is you've already got a lot of existing controls in place. You just need to pull them together so that it paints a picture from a system perspective.
Yeah, and sing out to us if you need a hand. Steve,
Kristen, I was going to say, Steve Morris has got his hand up.
Thank
Actually
you.
had his hand up.
Over to you, Steve.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep, got you.
Yep.
Yeah, just the video's not coming in. Oh, look, thank you. It's been a great session so far. Look, I suppose the question I had was a contextual one. It's been reflected that we're doing particularly badly in Australia. I just wanted to know whether some particular dynamics, which means that we are doing badly compared to, say, your international comparators.
Can I just dive in, Kristen?
Yeah,
Great
go
question,
for it.
Steve, and thank you for sharing that. So, look, there's a couple of ways to think about it, and Will might have a view as well. But with any new thing on the market, that there's always sort of problems and issues when you look at it. So regulators and employers have never really been focused on psychosocial safety in the past. It's not new. It's been there forever. It's buried in the health bit of OHS. The last few years has percolated it to the top, so now we're actually looking at it. And when you look at things that have never been addressed previously, that's when you'll find it. So there's one way to look at Australia being bad is because we've never looked at it previously, and now we are. We're actually getting visibility of what the true workplace landscape is like. And for me, that's not necessarily the worst case scenario. What that is that's our benchline. It's about what we do moving forward from then. So I'm currently in Taipei in Taiwan, and I've been speaking at a conference and doing some work with the OHS regulator here in Taiwan, and I was talking to a colleague from the US OHS agency. So the US hasn't even got this on their radar yet. They've asked me to go over and talk to them about it. So this is really new, and a lot of what we would refer to as developed nations, more mature nations, still don't view psychosocial safety as a safety issue, and Australia is probably one of the world's leading jurisdictions in this regard. But I think hopefully what I'd like to see in the next sort of 5 to 10 years is a couple of things. One, we start seeing downward trends on the bad, and that we see some sort of tangible improvements to people's mental health and well-being. And another thing I'd really like to see is what one of the human values, what we are doing as a profit for purpose is investing our money back into research so we can have academia work with us to show what actually works in practice. So if we put some controls in place, how do we know that they're working and they've got the real sort of value that we hope to have? And what we want to be able to do with academia is pump some research into that so we can go back to the workforce and say, right, these things have been tried, this was with the benefit, this worked, this didn't. And that's really sort of one of the founding values of humans, is that we want to be able to put some really easy to follow practical solutions that work on the ground at every level, whether you're BHP, whether you're a mum and dad bakery.
Kristen, I've got two questions here I'm going to combine together.
Yep.
Could we give some examples of could we give some examples of wellbeing initiatives you've seen having a positive impact? And I'm going to combine that with the question of how do we get away from the old mindset, my boss was tough on me and it's built me into who I am and helped me grow, a thick skin. So I think culture beats strategy for breakfast is the old cliche. This has got to start. So a safety culture rather than compliance. Okay, so leadership behaviour is culture. And so I think this has to start with leadership capability uplift, with genuine commitment from leadership that manifests in concerted, consistent action that reflects a commitment to wellbeing, adequate leadership training and skills development in things like having difficult conversations. And then I think it very much depends on your organisation, what wellbeing initiative is actually going to get the most traction. So it's not just throwing EAP into the mix. That's great, but that's not enough. It needs to be a holistic strategy that has multiple components locking together, that in consultation with your teams and workforces are more than just those sort of reactive initiatives. So we've got sort of 3 levels of controls, and what we're seeing is people sort of tinkering with the tertiary level and not the primary level. So coming back to how work is done in the real world, and workload management, workforce planning, role descriptions, role clarity, that whole piece. So unfortunately, there's not one single answer to this. It's going to be a composite picture of consistent, concerted progress. And the key is to just start, like Martin said. Progress beats perfection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. Like, I'm out in the trenches as an HR person doing a lot of the heavy lifting around some of this stuff with clients. And I think consultation is key. You have to engage your workforce. It can't just be decided at the boardroom table, and it can't just be decided at the exec table. You have to engage your people from bottom up, top down approach. And you really need to start listening to them. I think if you are able to give people a safe space to speak and contribute, it's amazing what you'll hear from your employees if you just start to open up that dialogue. Now, I think, Wayne, you've just come off, you're keen to chat.
Yeah, hi everybody. Look, this has been fantastic, and Martin, good to see you again.
You too.
I really think that bringing this to the table is a great start. Change management's always a difficult thing, and this is going to be a long, hard task. And as long as we're all aware of that, there's no quick fix to it. But I think one of the things that the larger corporate businesses are aware of this and starting to move towards it. But that small business has no idea and is running really, really scared at the moment.
Yeah.
And I feel so bad for them. And Martin, you might be able to relate to this, but when this psychosocial issue first came up, the regulator pumped out a 35-page risk assessment, and all of the small clients came to us and wept and said, we can't get through running our business on a day-to-day basis, and now we need to either learn how to manage this risk or pay you to help us manage this risk. When is it ever going to stop? So I want to put that back into the table and say, whilst a lot of the medium and corporate businesses will find the resources to do this, Martin, you used a good term, cool your jets.
Yeah.
Right. We need to get small business to cool their jets and slow down. And we need to just understand that if they move this into their hazard and risk registers, they've started the process.
Yeah.
100%.
Very
mate.
good call
Thanks
out.
for my time.
Yeah, very, very
100%.
good call out. Thank you, Wayne. Okay, so I'm mindful of time. We are bang on 1 o'clock. So unless there is a really burning issue that we need to answer, what I would like to do is say thank you to all of our incredible panelists for coming along and spending some time with you today over our Lunch and Learn series. We've just popped up a page there for you to have a look at. We've got a lead human kicking off for anyone that's really keen to start to get their staff from a leadership point of view across a whole bunch of what we've just discussed today. Look, this is just the iceberg effect today. This is just the starting of bringing this to life. Equally, what we're offering to anyone that takes up the Lead Human program that's from the webinar, they'll get an individual human movement membership thrown in, which is normally $390. So they'll get the first year membership, which will give that particular person access to a whole bunch of things like these webinars. There's tools that we've created to be able to help people that are in small business. They'll be able to actually walk away with the human movement badge to say that they are really part of a global community of people that are really trying to make a difference. And for those people that do have Gen Zs in their business, this is some of the stuff that recruiters are now calling out and saying that the younger people are looking for, which is why we pulled Human together in the first place. It was all about going, how do we actually show the world that we're really actually serious about humanizing humans in our business. And then finally, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody that's come along today and spent their lunchtime with us. We're really, really thrilled with the number of people that have registered to attend. We're doing a registration or expression of interest at the moment for our next one, which will be next month. So on behalf of all of us from Human, thank you so much. If you've got any questions when you hop off from here, feel free to send us through an email at the hello address that's on your screen. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.